There is, somewhere in the dim corridors of Whitehall, a sound that has never ceased. It is not a human voice, nor the echo of footsteps. It is the hum of paper, the restless, whispering current of a bureaucracy that has survived the ages. It began with the Empire, perhaps even before it, when ink first touched vellum under candlelight, and clerks, unseen and dutiful, began to record the great affairs of the realm in an endless procession of ledgers. Over time, those ledgers grew into files, those files into forms, and those forms into a system so intricate, so quietly omnipresent, that it became something almost sacred. Within that system, among its millions of pages, lies one particular document, the Civil Service Pension Application Form, an instrument of quiet dignity and solemn expectation, born of necessity, nurtured by regulation, and enshrined in tradition. The British civil service, in its long and meticulous history, has always been a machine of stillness. Every motion, every decision, is wrapped in the comforting slowness of deliberation. To the outside world, it may appear inert, like a sleeping colossus of paper and habit. Yet within, unseen forces turn, the rules, the memoranda, the signatures, the faint scratch of pen upon form. These are the heartbeats of an empire that learned to rule not through war, but through the management of documents. And among these documents, none carried a weight more profound, more quietly personal, than the pension regulations. Pension, in its earliest sense, was not merely payment for service rendered. It was remembrance, a recognition of duty, a promise that the state, with all its cold impartiality, would remember the individual who had once served it. To apply for a pension was to enter into a ritual of acknowledgement, the servant presenting himself before the institution responding in its measured voice of forms and procedures. There was grace in that exchange, if one looked closely enough, a kind of bureaucratic mercy. Imagine, then, the year 1855. The air of London is thick with coal dust and the smell of iron rails. In the Treasury chambers, under the gaze of portraits of forgotten chancellors, a committee sits in quiet deliberation. Their task is not glorious, nor celebrated in newspapers. They are revising the regulations concerning the award and application of civil service pensions. There are clauses to amend, tables to balance, precedents to cite. And yet, in the stillness of that room, history is being written, not the kind of history sung in ballads or carved in stone, but the kind that hums beneath the surface of civilization, the regulation of service, the codification of gratitude, the ritual of the end of duty. The regulations themselves are elegant in their precision. Paragraphs unfold like verses from an obscure psalm, each line concerned with the delicate interplay between time, labor, and recompense. No officer, one clause reads, shall be entitled to a pension unless he has served the crown faithfully for not less than 10 years. Another insists upon the attestation of moral conduct and satisfactory performance, duly certified by a superior officer. These are not simply rules, they are instruments of moral architecture. They tell a story of a nation that sought to make virtue legible, to translate loyalty into a line on a balance sheet, and service into an entitlement neatly recorded in triplicate. Outside, in the fog-laden streets, a postman might be delivering the blank forms themselves, heavy paper embossed with the royal seal, folded with reverence. Each form, when opened, releases the faint smell of starch and dust. The applicant, perhaps a clerk of 30 years' service or a customs officer whose eyesight has begun to fail, would spread it upon his table and stare at the instructions. The form speaks in measured tones, name, in full. Rank or position. Date of first appointment. Date of cessation of service. Cause of retirement. Every question invites reflection, a quiet inventory of life and labor. It is not simply data the form demands, it is confession. And in its completion, the servant of the crown becomes once more a subject of the great administrative order that has shaped his days. There is something curiously devotional in the way these forms were designed. The spacing of the lines, the curvature of the printed script, the faint watermark visible when held against the light, all suggest an awareness of the sacred in the mundane. The civil servant, filling in his particulars, might not realize it, but he is participating in a rite older than himself, the ritual by which the state reclaims its servants through paperwork. The act of applying becomes, in a sense, the final act of service. The clerks who processed these applications were no less part of the ritual. In the offices of Somerset House, they sat beneath high ceilings and ticking clocks, surrounded by the rhythmic murmur of pens. Each application would arrive with a covering letter, sealed and initialed, often accompanied by testimonials or medical reports. The clerks handled them as priests might handle relics, carefully, methodically, reverently. The handwriting varied, some bold and confident, others trembling and faint. Every signature was a farewell, every date a closing of a chapter. Yet for the clerks, there was no sentimentality, only duty. Their task was to ensure compliance with regulation, the purity of order preserved through the purity of process. And yet, beneath the surface of these transactions, there lingered an atmosphere of quiet unease. The machinery of bureaucracy, in its perfection, leaves little room for humanity's irregularities. A missed date, an incomplete attestation, a mislaid certificate, and the machinery stalls, indifferent to the man who has devoted his life to it. In the archives, there are letters written in fading ink by retired officials pleading for reconsideration, for acknowledgement, for fairness. Some are answered. Some are not. Each is absorbed into the great silence of the administrative record, a silence that hums, even now, beneath the marble floors of the Treasury. By the late 19th century, the pension regulations had become a document of near-religious complexity. Whole departments were dedicated to their interpretation. Committees met to debate the meaning of a single clause, the difference between shall and may, between service and employment. To the uninitiated, such debates might seem trivial. But within the walls of the civil service, these words were fate itself. To retire with pension was to be seen, to be validated by the structure that had defined one's existence. To be denied was to vanish, quietly, efficiently, into obscurity. In time, the regulations took on a life of their own. They were revised, expanded, annotated, cross-referenced. They began to read not merely as administrative law but as scripture, the bureaucratic book of life, recording the conditions of service and the price of memory. Scholars of the civil state came to admire the precision of its clauses. Foreign administrations borrowed from it. Even as empires rose and fell, the regulations endured, adjusting subtly to new forms of government, new currencies, new social ideals. But the voice that spoke through them remained the same, calm, measured, paternal, eternal. In the 20th century, as the world convulsed through wars and reconstructions, the pension regulations persisted. They were copied onto new paper, printed in new fonts, administered through new technologies, yet their spirit remained untouched. Somewhere, deep within the Ministry of Pensions, an archivist might still unfold an original 1883 form and run her fingers across its surface. The paper would be brittle, the ink browned with time, but the words would remain legible. Applicant must declare that all statements herein are true to the best of his knowledge and belief. The tone is timeless, unwavering. It does not comfort, nor does it threaten. It simply endures, the voice of an institution that believes, perhaps more than any religion, in the sanctity of procedure. One might imagine, in the stillness of night, when the office lights are dimmed and the corridors of Whitehall are deserted, that the old forms breathe faintly. That somewhere, in the vast drawers of the National Archives, the pension applications murmur among themselves, whispering the names of those who once filled them, the years of service, the signatures in faded blue ink. A strange communion of the living and the administrative, bound together by the persistence of paper. It is said that the sound of rustling in the archives at midnight is not the settling of air, but the soft rustle of documents remembering. Thus begins the story of the official British Civil Service regulations for pension application forms, not merely as a bureaucratic instrument, but as a mirror of the state's conscience. Within its clauses lies a reflection of how a nation understands gratitude, order, and mortality. For to regulate the end of service is, in its own way, to meditate upon the end of life itself. And if there is something unsettling in that realization, the awareness that one's existence, one's decades of labor, might be distilled into a few lines on a government form, it is because bureaucracy, at its deepest level, touches upon the same truths that religion once guarded: memory, judgment, redemption. And so the story unfolds, page by page, through the long corridors of administration, where pens whisper like prayers and the smell of dust mingles with eternity. In those quiet halls, the regulations wait, patient, unchanging, eternal, as generations of servants come and go, their names inscribed in ink, their lives recorded in order, their worth measured in years and clauses. The machine continues, serene and tireless, as if powered not by men but by the slow, unwavering pulse of history itself. And if one listens closely, very closely, beneath the hum of the city, beneath the ticking of the clock, one might still hear it, the faint shuffle of forms being filled, the echo of ink upon paper, the unending murmur of the civil service, dreaming, forever, in its quiet halls. To begin with, there was the ledger. Long before the pension forms existed in their printed solemnity, before the neat grids and numbered clauses, there was the ledger, bound in dark calfskin, its spine faintly cracked, its pages edged with the faint shimmer of dust. It sat upon a clerk's desk in the Treasury office, its cover heavy with the weight of years. Within its pages, every entry began with a name, written in ink that darkened over the decades from the color of wine to the color of old blood. The handwriting varied, but the intention was always the same, to preserve, with exactitude, the truth of service. A man's labor, transcribed into the language of accountancy. In that ledger, each stroke of the pen had consequence. There was a beauty to its order, the symmetry of margins, the rhythmic elegance of numerals aligned in their columns, the careful curls of the copperplate script. It was said among the clerks that the handwriting of the Treasury was the most honest in the kingdom. To write clearly was to serve faithfully, to err in ink was to err in duty. Thus, the clerks became artists of precision, their pens moving not swiftly but deliberately, as if aware that they were inscribing permanence. Every figure, every annotation, carried the authority of the state. It is strange to think how such quiet actions, the turning of a page, the signing of a name, could contain within them the vast machinery of empire. Yet they did. For each ledger line corresponded to a human life, an officer in Calcutta, a surveyor in Belfast, a customs inspector in Liverpool, a postmaster in the distant Orkneys. From the bustling heart of the empire to its silent extremities, the ledgers gathered their names, binding them all into the same order, the same rhythm of bureaucracy. To serve the crown was to become a number, yes, but also a story, recorded in meticulous hand, safeguarded from the decay of memory by the permanence of ink. The clerk who opened the ledger each morning was part of a lineage stretching back centuries. His uniform was modest, his authority almost invisible, yet he belonged to one of the most enduring castes of the modern world, the bureaucrat. He had inherited, perhaps unknowingly, the rituals of the monastic scribe, the patience of the accountant, and the quiet pride of the archivist. In his silence, the machinery of the state found its most dependable rhythm. The world outside could roar and change, governments fall, monarchs die, wars begin, but in the office, under the faint glow of gaslight, the pen continued its steady motion. It was from these ledgers that the first pension regulations were born. The idea had been simple enough, that those who had given their service to the crown should not be left destitute in old age. But simplicity rarely survives contact with administration. The question of who qualified, and how much they were entitled to, proved labyrinthine. There were debates on what constituted faithful service, how to measure moral conduct, and whether dismissal for infirmity counted as retirement or disgrace. Every rule begot exceptions, and every exception required a new clause. The regulations grew like ivy along the walls of the Treasury, intricate, self-sustaining, impossible to uproot. When, in 1822, the Treasury issued the instructions relating to the granting of pensions and superannuation allowances, it was not merely setting policy. It was creating a new kind of moral universe. In that universe, loyalty was quantified, time was sanctified, and the end of a career became a legal event, one that could only be completed through formality. No pension shall be granted without proper verification of service, the document declared, and with that sentence, the state asserted its quiet dominion over memory itself. To remember service was no longer a matter of gratitude or sentiment, it was a matter of paperwork. The application form, still in its earliest incarnation, was born from this need for verification. At first, it was not a printed sheet but a series of entries written by hand upon foolscap. The applicant was required to provide his particulars, the dates of his appointments, the nature of his duties, and the cause of his retirement. The language was impersonal, the tone courteous yet distant. The undersigned humbly applies. One typical opening would begin, followed by a litany of dates and attestations. Yet behind that humble phrasing lay a profound dependency. The petitioner, after a lifetime of obedience, was once more subject to the impersonal gaze of authority. In the quiet offices where these applications were examined, the atmosphere was curiously reverent. Clerks spoke in hushed tones, as though discussing the fates of the departed. Each application was treated as both document and relic. The margins bore annotations, small decisions rendered in a hand less elegant than the applicant's own. Approved. Pending further evidence. Rejected for insufficient service. The words were sparse, but they carried finality. There were no appeals beyond the regulations, there was no higher mercy than compliance. The handwriting of rejection was always firmer, darker. The ink seemed to bite deeper into the paper, as if to remind the applicant that the state's memory was indelible. Those whose applications were denied would receive formal letters, composed in the purest bureaucratic tone, neither sympathetic nor unkind, but serenely factual. Sir, I am directed to inform you that your claim to a pension cannot be allowed under the provisions of the Act of 1834. And with that, a life of service would close with a single sentence, perfectly punctuated, beyond appeal. Yet for those accepted, the process held a strange dignity. The successful applicant would receive a certificate embossed with the royal crest, declaring his entitlement to an annual allowance. His name would be entered in the register of pensioners, his service thus made eternal in the state's records. The certificate was more than mere paper, it was a secular sacrament, proof that one's years had not vanished into the ether of anonymity. To hold it was to feel, however faintly, that the machinery of the nation had recognized one's existence. And always, there were signatures. The act of signing, by clerk, by secretary, by official, was the final benediction of the process. The pen paused briefly before each name, as though aware of the solemnity of the act. To sign a pension form was to connect oneself, however fleetingly, to the infinite procession of signatures that had come before. It was said that the Treasury retained, in its vaults, the earliest pension records still bearing the ink of clerks long dead, their signatures dark against the fading paper, as if still alive in their precision. There is something quietly haunting in the thought that bureaucracy outlives those who create it. Each generation of clerks trains the next, each leaving behind their own marginalia, their peculiar abbreviations, their habits of notation. The handwriting evolves, but the spirit remains. Thus the regulations persist, not merely as text but as culture, the living tradition of paperwork. To read through a century's worth of pension files is to witness, not the history of individuals, but the slow evolution of the administrative mind. It is a history written not in grand proclamations, but in the calm continuity of form. At times, the system seemed almost aware of itself. The prefaces to each new edition of the regulations often contained curious reflections, acknowledgments of the difficulty inherent in the equitable administration of long service, or the necessity of clarity in the attestation of duty. One senses, reading them, that the authors understood the philosophical weight of their task. They were not merely drafting rules, they were attempting to define fairness in procedural terms. And in doing so, they gave shape to one of the quiet miracles of modern governance, the belief that justice could be achieved through form-filling. Yet even as the machinery perfected itself, the human element could never entirely disappear. The clerks were human, after all, and sometimes, late in the evening, when the office lamps burned low and the corridors fell silent, one might imagine a flicker of reflection crossing a face bent over a file. Did they ever wonder about the lives behind the forms? The hands that trembled as they wrote their final applications? The faces that would never be seen again once the paperwork was filed and sealed? Perhaps they did, briefly, before turning another page, aligning another column, dipping the pen once more into its inkwell. For in the end, the ledger demanded completion. Every line must be filled, every total must balance. To leave a page unfinished was unthinkable, it was disorder, and disorder was an affront to the civil creed. The ledgers, like the regulations, could not tolerate incompleteness. They were, in their way, mirrors of eternity, endless, unyielding, and indifferent to the frailties of the human lives they recorded. As the century turned and the empire spread its wings across continents, the ledgers multiplied. The pension department moved to larger quarters, the forms were standardized, printed, distributed in bulk. What had once been the careful work of a handful of clerks became an industrial process. Forms arrived by the hundreds, then thousands, each bearing a story, each awaiting its place in the archive. The Treasury, ever cautious, issued further instructions to ensure consistency. All applications shall be completed in ink of black or blue-black color only. Erasures shall render the document void unless countersigned by a superior officer. Precision became law, law became habit. And through it all, the pens continued their whispering, an endless susurrus of ink and paper, the sound of a nation documenting its own endurance. Outside, revolutions reshaped the world, within, the forms remained unchanged. In their stillness, there was something both reassuring and deeply strange, as if the state, through its regulations, had discovered a means of halting time. The ledger, now bound in newer covers, no longer smelled of dust but of fresh paper and ironed cloth. Yet its essence remained unaltered. Every name inscribed within it was a thread in the fabric of continuity, binding generations of servants to the same quiet purpose. The pension regulations, in their expanding complexity, had become more than a manual, they were a philosophy of governance, a theology of order. Through them, the British civil service had found its voice, calm, impartial, tireless, and eternal. And still, the signatures multiplied, thousands upon thousands, like stars in a bureaucratic firmament, each a mark of service completed, each a small flicker of existence acknowledged by the great administrative machine. By the late Victorian age, the British civil service had perfected its devotion to paper. To walk through the offices of Somerset House or the Treasury Chambers in those years was to step into a cathedral of documentation. The air itself seemed infused with the perfume of parchment and ink. Shelves rose like pillars, supporting ledgers that stretched from floor to ceiling. Beneath them, rows of clerks sat in perfect alignment, their heads bowed, their pens moving in synchronized rhythm, a quiet orchestra of bureaucracy, each stroke a note in the great administrative symphony. The room was lit by tall windows whose pale light softened the dust that floated perpetually in the air, giving the place an almost sacred glow. Here, the pension forms were not mere documents but living entities, each carrying a pulse of memory. They moved through the office like pilgrims, passed from one desk to another, accumulating annotations and approvals, signatures and seals. To trace a form's journey was to witness a ritual both elegant and inexorable. It began with the applicant, somewhere far from Whitehall, perhaps a surveyor in the colonies, a telegraph operator on the coast, or a clerk in a provincial customs office. His form would arrive folded and official, traveling by mailbags and ship's holds until it found its way to the pension division. There it would be unsealed, examined, docketed, and entered into the register, the modern equivalent of a baptismal record. Each form was assigned a number, precise and unique. The numbering system was itself an art, a way of ensuring that even amidst millions of papers, no identity would be lost. The clerks took pride in the purity of that order. To misnumber a form was not simply an error, it was a sin against the sacred coherence of administration. The numbering, like the liturgy, must never falter. The applicant's handwriting, faint or confident, now mingled with that of the clerks who reviewed it. Layers of ink recorded a chain of command, initials, comments, corrections, all in different shades of blue-black. Sometimes, beneath the polite formality of these notes, one senses the faint pulse of compassion. Recommend for favorable consideration, a junior officer might write, his nib scratching with faint defiance against the cautious tone of authority. Above his note, a senior official would inscribe, approved, subject to verification of service. It was a quiet negotiation between humanity and regulation, conducted in the language of marginalia. And then came the signature, that delicate ceremony by which authority took visible form. The signing officer would pause, adjust his spectacles, steady his hand. He would write his name slowly, the ink pooling slightly at the final flourish. The page would seem to exhale, completed, sanctified, and sent onward through the labyrinth. The form, now fully born, would be bound, filed, and stored in its rightful place among thousands of others. There is something haunting in the idea that so much human life, decades of service, ambition, fatigue, could be distilled into so little space. A few lines of ink, a set of dates, a signature, and an embossed seal. Yet within that distillation lies a strange kind of immortality. The forms endure long after their authors are gone. The ink fades, yes, but the handwriting remains legible, the signatures remain distinct. Centuries later, an archivist might trace a fingertip along those same lines and feel, in that moment, a whisper of continuity, the touch of an absent clerk whose pen once trembled in the gaslight. By 1890, the regulations themselves had expanded into a formidable volume. They were bound in green cloth, stamped with the crest of the crown, and distributed to every department of the civil service. The language within was impeccable, clear, impersonal, and yet curiously poetic in its restraint. Phrases such as, in recognition of meritorious conduct, and, in cases where service has been unavoidably interrupted, possessed the rhythm of Scripture. The clauses flowed like verses, their cadence calm, their meaning absolute. For those who lived by them, the regulations were not simply rules, they were doctrine. In their preface, one could detect an almost philosophical tone. The state, it declared, must temper justice with compassion, but compassion must be rendered measurable through form. The sentence encapsulated the spirit of the age, a belief that moral virtue could be codified, that mercy could be administered through paperwork. To fill a form was to engage in an act of trust, faith in the machinery of fairness. For all its impersonality, the civil service was an act of collective belief in the permanence of order, in the idea that every action, properly recorded, could achieve a kind of moral equilibrium. But there were murmurs, even then, among the staff. Some clerks whispered of the ghost forms, files that disappeared from their shelves only to reappear weeks later, bearing signatures that no one remembered writing. Others spoke of the uncanny quiet of the archive rooms after hours, where the papers seemed to shift faintly in the darkness, as though rearranging themselves. It was, of course, dismissed as superstition. Yet those who had worked long enough in the pension office understood that bureaucracy, like faith, bred its own mysteries. In a place where nothing was ever truly destroyed, only filed, cross-referenced, or archived, the past was never dead. It simply waited, folded neatly, in its proper compartment. At times, new clerks would describe dreams after their first weeks on duty. Dreams of endless corridors lined with filing cabinets that seemed to stretch into infinity. Dreams where voices whispered in the language of regulation, where ink glowed faintly in the dark. Some awoke with the impression that the forms themselves were alive, sentient in their accumulation. Yet in the morning, the world of paper resumed its calm routine, and the dreams were forgotten. Still, beneath the tranquil surface, one senses a slow transformation. As the 19th century waned, the machinery of the civil service became increasingly self-aware. The forms no longer merely recorded life, they shaped it. A man's career was now planned in accordance with the provisions of retirement. His conduct, his punctuality, his very demeanor were evaluated not as moral qualities, but as measurable criteria for pension eligibility. The regulations, once descriptive, had become prescriptive. The servant no longer merely followed the law, he lived within it, his future bound to its paragraphs. It was during this period that the Treasury introduced the Form P-12, application for superannuation allowance. Its layout was a marvel of efficiency, 22 sections arranged in symmetrical precision, each requiring a declaration, signature, or supporting document. The language was polite but unwavering. Applicant must certify that all particulars are correct to the best of his knowledge. The undersigned acknowledges that any misstatement may render the pension void. The tone was gentle, yet there was an undercurrent of finality, the voice of the state, patient but absolute. Those who filled it often did so with care bordering on reverence. The instructions advised the use of permanent ink and legible hand, as if these choices carried moral weight. And in a way, they did. The handwriting became a measure of character, the neatness of the form a sign of discipline. Clerks who reviewed these applications claimed they could discern a man's entire career in the shape of his letters, the confidence of command in the sweep of a capital C, the humility of service in the careful restraint of his punctuation. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the pension process was its silence. Once an application left the applicant's hands, it vanished into the vastness of the system. Weeks, sometimes months, would pass before an answer arrived. During that time, the applicant lived in a state of suspension, neither servant nor pensioner, neither remembered nor forgotten. It was as though his identity existed only in the liminal space between two documents. When at last the reply came, the envelope bore the seal of the Treasury, and within it, a verdict rendered in perfect courtesy. To open such a letter was to confront one's life translated into administrative judgment. In the grand ledger of the pension department, every approved case was marked with a neat check, every rejection with a thin red line. The book, viewed from a distance, resembled a tapestry of decisions, a silent record of who had been granted remembrance and who had been consigned to oblivion. The clerks who turned its pages might pause sometimes, tracing a finger over the red lines, wondering briefly about the lives they represented. But the work continued. The ledger must be completed. The balance must remain true. In time, the rituals of signature and certification became so ingrained that they took on an almost mystical quality. To sign one's name was no longer a mere administrative act, it was a declaration of faith in the continuity of order. Every penstroke connected the living servant to a lineage of clerks and officers who had done the same before him. Even death could not dissolve the contract entirely, for the archives retained what the body relinquished. The pension form was, in its way, an artifact of immortality, a trace of life that the machinery refused to let fade. It is perhaps fitting, then, that the pension office was said to be one of the quietest buildings in London. Its silence was not emptiness but density, the stillness of meaning accumulated over generations. The clerks walked softly, spoke gently, and handled each document as though it were a fragment of history. And perhaps it was. For within the plain language of regulation, within its clauses and subclauses, its tables and appendices, lay the story of a civilization that believed not in chaos, but in continuity, not in passion, but in procedure. When the clock struck 6, the lamps were dimmed and the ledgers closed. The clerks would rise, straighten their chairs, and file silently toward the exit. Yet even as they departed, one might sense that the papers continued to breathe in their absence, the ink settling, the forms whispering softly to one another in the language of the archived. The door would close, the lock would click, and the pension department would fall into its nightly stillness. A stillness not of death, but of endurance. The ledgers slept, but they dreamed, of signatures yet to come, of names yet to be inscribed, of the unbroken lineage of service stretching endlessly forward into the dark. There was a time, long before the modern efficiencies of digital forms and automated approvals, when a man's pension was not a number in a system but a ritual, a ceremonial exchange between the self and the state. In the heart of Whitehall, amid a hush broken only by the ticking of the great brass clock and the soft clatter of pen nibs, the process of applying for a pension resembled a sacred act. The officials who presided over these papers, the civil servants of mid-century Britain, moved with the deliberation of monks at a cloistered altar. Their desks were arranged in measured precision, oak surfaces polished to a muted gleam, stacks of cream-colored forms aligned like the folds of a parchment scripture. To the uninitiated, the pension regulations were tedious, to the initiate, they were profound. Each clause, each line of instruction, bore the weight of decades, the sediment of rulings, amendments, and memoranda that had calcified into doctrine. There were whispers among the clerks that no one had ever read the full text from start to finish. Its earliest passages, drafted in the late 19th century, spoke in a language thick with deference and order. Later revisions added the cautious vocabulary of empire in decline, subject to review, in accordance with established custom, contingent upon satisfactory service. The clerks who processed these applications were not merely record keepers, they were interpreters of the administrative mind. Their training impressed upon them that the form was more than a form, it was an extension of the individual's worthiness, a mirror through which the state beheld its servants. The act of filling one out correctly required more than literacy, it required submission. One could sense it even in the phrasing of the questions. State the period of your employment in the service of His Majesty's government, or, later, specify the duration of your contribution under the established scheme. They were inquiries that seemed to probe not merely time, but loyalty. As evening descended upon the civil service offices, the gaslights flickered into life, casting their mellow glow across the files. The clerks would continue their labors into the blue dusk, the scratching of pens becoming a kind of low chant. In that repetition, the entering of figures, the checking of dates, the stamping of seals, there was a meditative rhythm. Some of them began to dream of the forms even in sleep, blank spaces unfurling across endless corridors of paper, signatures repeating like echoes of forgotten oaths. It was said that the most senior of the clerks, the chief examiner of pensions, no longer distinguished between day and night. He had worked in the same office since 1919, when he first joined the ministry as a youth, sorting envelopes in the aftermath of the Great War. Now, decades later, his thin hair silvered and his hands trembling slightly with age, he still occupied the same chair, his spectacles forever sliding down his nose. To him, the pension regulations had become a living scripture, expanding with each decade like a vine twisting through the architecture of the office itself. Every new amendment required his oversight. Each footnote had to be examined, compared against previous statutes, reconciled with precedent. Yet even he, it was rumored, did not know the true origin of several key sections. There were clauses whose wording referred to departments that no longer existed, ministries dissolved before his birth, and obscure cross-references to Appendix 9, classified. The paper trail, in places, became circular, leading the reader back to earlier instructions that no longer made sense. It was here, in these recursive passages, that the line between governance and mysticism began to blur. The chief examiner once remarked, quietly, to a subordinate clerk, that the regulations might be self-sustaining. That is, they might continue to generate meaning long after their creators were gone, as if the bureaucratic process itself had learned to dream. He would sit at his desk after the others had gone home, the building empty except for the faint hum of the ventilation and the echo of his own movements. The file cabinet stood like tall sentinels, row upon row, their drawers containing not just documents but the traces of lives, teachers, guardsmen, railway officials, each reduced to paper, each awaiting judgment. The chief examiner's fingers would hover over the next file, and in that stillness, he sometimes imagined he could hear the faint murmur of all those former servants whispering through the pages. Not words, exactly, more like the suggestion of a sigh, the echo of pens scratching long ago. Outside, the city slept under a veil of fog. The lamps along Whitehall burned pale gold through the mist. In the silence, the boundary between the administrative and the ethereal grew thin. One could almost believe that the ministry itself was dreaming, a vast mind composed not of neurons but of forms, signatures, and seals, its consciousness shaped by ink and instruction. It was said that once, years before the Second World War, a junior clerk had disappeared into the archives during an overnight audit. His name appeared in the attendance log, his handwriting precise and steady, but no one ever saw him leave. When they searched for him the next morning, they found his desk neatly arranged, his fountain pen still full of ink, a half-completed pension form before him. At the bottom, in the space marked, for official use only, a single phrase had been written in neat cursive, referred to the Department of Continuation. No such department existed. The discovery was quietly noted, and the records amended to indicate that the clerk had resigned voluntarily. But every few years since, a new employee would swear they had come across a memorandum stamped with that same title, Department of Continuation, without any reference number, dated in a style several decades out of fashion. The chief examiner discouraged inquiries. "It is a legacy category," he would murmur, as if invoking an old superstition. Over time, the regulations incorporated certain phrases that no one could trace. All applications shall be submitted to the Department of Continuation for classification. The phrase appeared only in one revision, in 1948, and was quietly omitted in 1952, yet somehow, copies of the earlier instruction kept resurfacing, in drawers, in envelopes misfiled and forgotten. Among the clerks, the words took on a quiet power. Some began to treat them as a kind of charm, a secret reassurance that their work mattered beyond the mortal span of employment. If the Department of Continuation existed, somewhere beyond the reach of time or record, then perhaps their forms, their signatures, their careful adherence to regulation, would persist forever. By the mid-1960s, the process of pension application had become almost liturgical in its precision. Each form required not only the applicant's details but the endorsement of 3 witnesses and the certification of authenticity by a ranking officer. Every document had to be folded in a specific way, the bottom edge turned precisely to meet the 3rd line of text, the upper margin pressed flat without crease. An applicant who folded incorrectly risked rejection on procedural grounds. And yet, even this risk became part of the ritual's strange allure. The applicants themselves, men and women who had served their country in offices, hospitals, and depots, would sit in the waiting room with their forms clutched tight, their faces pale in the morning light filtering through the frosted glass. They spoke in hushed tones, uncertain of what to expect. The clerks behind the counters wore expressions of calm authority, their movements deliberate, their words few. It was a system that demanded both patience and faith. For many, the form was their final correspondence with the state they had served, their final declaration of existence in a structure that had long since moved on without them. And though most would never know the names of the officials who processed their claims, they trusted that somewhere, deep in the ministry's labyrinth, their service was being weighed, their worth tallied, their future quietly approved. In that unseen machinery, a curious intimacy was born, the applicant and the clerk, the living and the archive, bound together by the silent exchange of ink. And in the vast hall of records, where the chief examiner still worked beneath the dim glow of lamps, the endless stream of forms continued. Each night he would rise, stretch his back, and gaze down the corridor of filing cabinets, the shadows deepening like water. Somewhere beyond, unseen yet palpable, he imagined the Department of Continuation, the perfect office where every form was filed, every pension approved, every servant accounted for. Perhaps, he sometimes thought, it was not an office at all. Perhaps it was the dream into which all bureaucrats eventually retired, an endless order, immaculate, serene. And in that thought, the chief examiner found something close to peace. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the ministry, soft and gray, illuminating the dust that drifted like faint, deliberate snow. It was the light of bureaucracy, patient, impartial, revealing everything and nothing at once. The clerks arrived in their coats and scarves, their breath visible in the corridor air before the radiators began to hum. Their footsteps echoed faintly, the same rhythm as yesterday, the same rhythm as decades past. The world outside might have changed, wars ended, governments fell, currencies shifted, but within these walls, the machinery of order remained unchanged, unmoved. There was a certain poetry to the place that only those who had worked within it could understand. Each regulation, each form, was a kind of verse, dry, yes, but precise, careful, unyielding in its cadence. And in this poetry, there was comfort. For the clerks who labored here, their duty was not to question but to preserve. They tended to the structure of the state as a gardener tends to a hedge, trimming, shaping, ensuring its continued form. The rules of the pension application were the living roots of that hedge, winding deep into soil made from centuries of precedent. Yet in recent years, something subtle had begun to stir. It began as murmurs, notes appearing on memos without authors, directives printed on official letterhead that no department claimed responsibility for. Some spoke of minor anomalies, applications processed before submission, forms that arrived already signed and sealed by unseen hands. Others dismissed it as clerical error, the harmless confusion of an aging system. But there were those, particularly the older staff, who whispered another explanation, that the Department of Continuation had awakened again. In the break room, where the air smelled faintly of tea and carbon paper, the younger clerks would laugh off such talk. A ghost department, they called it, smiling, shaking their heads. A legend for the pension men. But when the lights dimmed in the late afternoon and the halls grew silent except for the rustle of paper, even the boldest among them sometimes hesitated before opening the next file. For each form bore its own quiet gravity, a life reduced to lines, a career distilled to ink and signature, and behind that, something vast, something that never quite slept. The chief examiner, now nearly 80, continued his work. His hair had turned the color of faded paper, and his skin bore the same soft translucence. He read with the aid of a magnifying glass, tracing every clause, every revision. Yet even he had begun to feel the disquiet. Late at night, he found forms on his desk he did not remember authorizing, their edges browned as if aged, their handwriting elegant and unfamiliar. The dates of service belonged to men long dead, men whose files had been sealed decades ago. And yet here they were, their applications awaiting review once more. One evening, as he sat in the stillness of the office, the great clock above the registry struck 10. The sound reverberated through the hall like the tolling of a cathedral bell. The chief examiner looked up and found, for a moment, that the light had changed. It seemed softer, as though filtered through fog. The outlines of the desks appeared faintly doubled, as if another layer of the office lay behind it, shadow for shadow, desk for desk, stretching endlessly into the mist. He blinked, and it was gone. But from that night onward, he began to sense a quiet presence in the room after hours. The air seemed charged, the papers slightly shifting as though stirred by a passing breath. And occasionally, when he turned to fetch a file, he would glimpse movement in the corner of his eye, a figure, perhaps, in the next aisle, just beyond view. He never spoke of it. Instead, he buried himself in work. He reviewed the pension regulation of 1947, then the consolidations of 1952 and 1956, noting the subtle shifts in phrasing, the way service to the Crown had softened to service to the government, and how loyalty had been replaced with continued compliance. It was as though the very soul of the regulation had become gentler, more ambiguous, less human. And yet, amidst these gradual dilutions, one phrase persisted across all versions: all claims shall be considered by the Department of Continuation in accordance with the principles of due recognition. That sentence, he realized, had survived untouched for more than 70 years. No one had ever struck it out. No committee had ever debated its relevance. It existed as if outside time, beyond revision. The chief examiner traced the words with his trembling finger. The Department of Continuation, he murmured, the phrase hanging in the air like incense. In accordance with the principles of due recognition. He wondered what those principles were. Recognition of what? Of service? Of devotion? Of existence itself? Some nights, when the wind howled faintly through the old vents, he imagined he heard voices reciting that line in unison, somewhere deep below the building, a slow, rhythmic chant, layered with centuries of repetition. In time, the ministry decided to modernize. The younger staff were instructed to transfer the paper files into microfilm, and later, into early computer databases. Whole rooms of documents were boxed, labeled, and sent to storage. Some of the older clerks retired rather than face the new machinery. The end of the human touch, they muttered, as their pensions were processed, ironically, through the very forms they had once mastered. But even as the cabinets emptied, a curious discovery was made. The archivists found, deep in the sub-basement, an unlisted section sealed behind an iron door. Its lock was rusted, its signage worn down to faint letters, continuation. The key was nowhere to be found. No one could recall who had last worked there, nor when it had been sealed. The official blueprints showed nothing beyond that wall, only soil and foundation. Yet the faint hum of electricity seemed to emanate from within, as if the room beyond was still awake. The discovery caused a minor stir. A memorandum was drafted to evaluate the structural and archival significance of the sealed chamber. It passed through several hands, up through management, and finally to the chief examiner himself. He read it carefully, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow motion, he signed the bottom in his thin, elegant script. Beneath his signature, he wrote a single note in the margin, already accounted for. The memorandum was filed away. No further action was taken. Weeks passed. The office settled back into its rhythm. And yet, the sealed door remained, humming faintly in the dark. That winter, the chief examiner fell ill. His colleagues noticed his absence but said little. In the ministry, such things were handled quietly, with dignity. When he did not return, his belongings were boxed, his chair reassigned. Yet one file was left on his desk, the last he had ever reviewed. Its cover bore no applicant name, only a printed title, Department of Continuation, Revised Guidelines, Draft, Unissued. Inside were 10 pages, yellowed and typed on old stationery. The first line read, "All servants of the Crown shall, upon cessation of active duty, be transferred to the Department of Continuation for review, classification, and ongoing service as required." There were no signatures. No stamps. No record of authorship. The younger clerks, uncertain, placed it in a folder marked miscellaneous and filed it among the unverified papers. But even now, decades later, that file continues to resurface. In audits. In training exercises. In lists where no one expects it. Always in the same place, always pristine, always awaiting review. And perhaps that is what the chief examiner had come to understand, that the bureaucracy he served was not merely an instrument of order, but something older and quieter, something that sought to preserve the notion of service itself, beyond the reach of time. To work within it was to live inside a dream that belonged not to any single man, but to the machinery of the state, a dream that went on thinking long after the thinkers were gone. It is said that in the stillest hours of the night, when the ministry lies empty and the wind rattles softly against the windows, a faint light glows behind the door marked continuation. Some claim they have heard the sound of typing from within. Others, a murmur, steady, distant, like voices reciting familiar lines. They are not words of instruction, nor regulation, nor law. They are names. And if one listens closely enough, one might hear one's own among them. To the casual observer, the British Civil Service pension regulations were a collection of administrative formulas, tables of entitlements, age thresholds, percentages of salary, and conditions of eligibility. But to those who lived within their shadow, who breathed the air of the ministry and devoted their lives to the arithmetic of service, the regulations were something far deeper. They were a moral calculus, an unspoken covenant between the individual and the idea of the state itself, a record of fidelity written not in gold nor glory, but in ink. From the moment a young clerk entered the service, the notion of reward was made plain: service first, recompense after. Yet that promise was not immediate, it was deferred, distant, and conditional. Pension, they said, was the afterlife of duty, a quiet continuation for those who had carried the burden of governance with modesty and precision. And so, the forms that governed it were treated with reverence, their margins filled with annotations, their footnotes guarded like scripture. The regulations themselves evolved through slow accretion. The earliest drafts from the 1850s were terse and moralistic, shaped by the Victorian conviction that work ennobled the soul and that leisure was a privilege to be earned through decorum. Each revision that followed bore the subtle fingerprints of shifting centuries, imperial pride yielding to bureaucratic caution, moral language giving way to actuarial abstraction. The 20th century inherited this paper theology and rendered it mechanical. The machine of reward began to hum quietly in the background of national life, unseen but omnipresent, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. Yet what few recognized was that the machinery did not merely calculate reward, it defined it. The form became the measure of existence. Those whose careers could not be easily enumerated, the interpreters, the inspectors, the quiet men who had spent decades in postings so obscure that no one now remembered their offices, often found themselves unrecorded in the system. When they came forward at last, trembling and polite, form in hand, they would discover that their years of service existed nowhere in the ledgers. No record found, the clerk would say gently, and with that phrase, a lifetime vanished into administrative silence. To some, this was merely tragedy. To others, it was revelation. For if the form was the arbiter of worth, then only what was written existed. The ink was not representation, it was being. Within this understanding lay the quiet terror of the ministry. To misfile a document, to omit a line, to misplace a stamp, was to erase a portion of a life. That awareness made the clerks cautious, meticulous to the point of mania. It was said that one could recognize a pension clerk by the faint stain of blue ink on his thumb and the slight tremor in his fingers, not from age, but from the weight of precision carried too long. The offices themselves bore witness to this devotion. The air smelled of dust and wax, of folders long unopened, of carbon copies turned brittle with age. The desks were arranged in careful symmetry, and the lamps cast halos of amber over the forms. The faint whir of a typewriter or the slow sigh of a filing cabinet filled the silence like a kind of music. Each morning, at precisely 9 o'clock, the clerks would take their seats and begin their rituals. Papers were unfolded, margins inspected, stamps pressed against soft pads of crimson ink. Each action was deliberate, almost meditative. And beneath it all, an unspoken rhythm persisted, the awareness that their work was not merely clerical, but existential. Somewhere in the vastness of the civil service, the Department of Continuation was said to oversee this rhythm. It was not listed in the directories, nor mentioned in official correspondence, yet its influence was felt in subtle ways, in the occasional appearance of a supplementary form, or a paragraph inserted into the regulations without attribution. These additions were never questioned. They were accepted as naturally as rainfall, as if the ministry itself had exhaled them. The clerks who encountered such anomalies often reacted with quiet awe. There was something reassuring about the idea that the system could generate its own maintenance, that it required no master, no mortal hand to keep it alive. They imagined the Department of Continuation as a perfect office somewhere deep below the building, endless rows of desks, each occupied by invisible staff, their pens moving in unison, producing new amendments in flawless script. This image lingered in their minds during long hours of filing, a comforting fantasy that made the monotony bearable. For in the dream of the endless office, they saw the promise of transcendence, a place where no form was ever lost, where no service went unrecognized, where the machinery of reward functioned with eternal precision. There were, however, those who viewed this ideal with unease. Among the records of the Treasury Committee in 1933 lies an obscure memorandum titled Concerning the Autonomy of Administrative Procedure. It warns that certain sub-processes of pension review appear to perpetuate themselves without oversight, and that instances have been observed in which files classified as dormant continue to circulate, generating documentation absent from any living chain of custody. The memorandum was marked confidential and was never circulated beyond a handful of senior officials. Yet its tone betrays a subtle fear, a recognition that the machinery had begun to think for itself. For what happens when a system designed to measure service begins to serve its own continuity? The ministry's corridors, once symbols of rational order, began to take on a strange geometry. The longer one worked there, the more one felt that the building resisted comprehension. Doors led to offices no longer listed on the floor plans. Corridors seemed to stretch farther than their physical space allowed. And sometimes, in the late hours, one could swear the hum of the fluorescent lights carried a faint whisper, the sound of unseen clerks continuing their work in the dark. It was during these quiet hours that the concept of the machinery of reward revealed its true nature. For it was not merely a bureaucratic device, but a philosophy, a reflection of how a nation measured the value of its citizens. Pension was not charity, it was acknowledgement. It was the state's way of saying, you have existed in service, and your existence shall not be forgotten. But over time, the machinery forgot the people who built it. The names faded, the signatures blurred, and only the regulations endured. To the younger clerks of the post-war generation, the process seemed benign, even comforting. The forms gave order to chaos. The pension tables, though complex, offered predictability. Yet to those who had seen the system's evolution across decades, there was an undercurrent of unease, as though the living were merely maintaining the dreams of the dead. There were stories, always told quietly, never in daylight, of clerks who received internal memoranda from colleagues who had been deceased for years. Of forms that bore dates in the future. Of typewriters that produced words long after they were unplugged. These tales circulated in whispers, growing softer with each retelling, until they became part of the ministry's myth. But even myth, in such a place, carried the texture of truth. One afternoon in the 1970s, during the great effort to digitize the archives, an engineer tasked with scanning old pension forms discovered a file with no metadata. The folder was pristine, as though newly created, yet its contents referred to events from 1892. Each page bore a signature in blue-black ink, elegant and firm, all written in the same hand. The title at the top read, Regulation 32C, on the preservation of merit. No such regulation existed. The engineer, curious, brought it to his supervisor. By the next morning, the folder had vanished from his desk. When he inquired, no one admitted to retrieving it. He left the ministry soon after, unsettled by the feeling that the building itself had taken back what it considered its own. And still, the regulations continued to expand. By 1980, the pension code had grown to over 4,000 pages, encompassing every conceivable variation of employment, contribution, and entitlement. Yet the language retained its peculiar poetry, that slow, hypnotic rhythm that blurred the boundary between instruction and invocation. All persons who have rendered service shall, upon conclusion, be subject to review and acknowledgement. The words seemed to carry a tenderness that belied their mechanical function. Perhaps that was the secret beauty of it, that within the cold machinery of bureaucracy lay a strange kind of compassion. For all its opacity and formality, the system sought to ensure that no life was forgotten, no act of service entirely lost. Its processes might have been slow, its logic obscure, but beneath it all was the human longing to be seen, to be recorded, to be known. And so, the clerks continued their work. They filed, stamped, and certified, their hands steady, their faces calm. The machine turned endlessly, ink replacing breath, form replacing voice. At times, in the hush between one task and the next, they would glance up at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Was it the sound of the pipes, or the echo of unseen typewriters still working below? No one could say. But in that silence, they felt the presence of something vast, an order beyond comprehension, sustained not by power or faith, but by the endless continuity of procedure. The machinery of reward endured, as it always had, unfeeling and eternal. And somewhere within its whirring heart, the department of continuation continued to dream. In the stillness of late evening, the office of records took on a peculiar calm. The electric lamps hummed faintly, their filaments glowing like threads of amber suspended in silence. Rows of filing cabinets stood in solemn symmetry, their brass handles catching the faintest glimmers of light. To walk among them was to drift through a forest of administrative endurance, each drawer a trunk of stored intentions, each file a leaf pressed between the pages of a nation's continuity. The pension forms were there, nestled like fossils in the strata of governance, their language deliberate and serene, their format immutable. At this hour, one could imagine the air itself thickened by the residue of ink and breath, the accumulation of a century's correspondence. The clerks had gone home hours ago, but the papers seemed to breathe on without them, faintly rustling as if animated by memory. The regulations within the pension manuals were not merely rules, they were incantations of trust. Each paragraph bound together two lives, the individual who had served and the institution that promised, in return, the quiet dignity of support. But dignity, in this place, was not an emotion, it was a function. It lived in margins, in clauses, in the precision of line spacing and the stern eloquence of bureaucratic prose. The British civil service had long treated the pension as both a culmination and a continuation, a ritual of completion that transformed years of service into a final certificate of acknowledgement. In this transformation lay an invisible ceremony, one not attended by the public but enacted through paper. The applicant filled in his particulars, his name, his department, his years of loyal attendance, and submitted them not to a person, but to the system, that vast and wordless entity. Somewhere, an unseen hand would receive it, weigh its propriety, confirm its arithmetic. Somewhere else, a seal would descend like a verdict. And thus, the machinery of reward turned once more, silent, perfect, and unending. There was something curiously human in the impersonality of it all. The regulations, so measured, so cautious, were like a mirror that reflected the collective effort to preserve fairness, even if fairness was itself a fiction constructed by paragraphs. The rules stated, each officer, upon conclusion of 30 years meritorious service, shall be entitled to an annual allowance not exceeding 2/3 of his salary, subject to review. But behind those words lay faces, a postman's thin smile as he filled the last entry, a clerk's trembling hand as she folded her document, a pension officer's weary gaze as he signed his name beneath another. These were the living artifacts of a system that sought permanence through the fragility of ink. The ink itself was another matter. It had a ritualistic significance, iron gall, in the older days, thick and blue-black, made from oak galls and ferrous sulfate. It stained the paper with permanence, its acidity biting deep into the fibers. The pension books demanded such ink, for impermanence was intolerable. The forms were to be legible a century hence, their letters were to endure even as the names faded from memory. One might say the ink remembered better than the institution. In time, it outlasted the offices, the ledgers, even the regulations that bore it. One could open an old pension volume and find within it a strange intimacy, the way the nib hesitated over a letter, or the way a clerk's hand betrayed fatigue at the end of a page. Every form bore its quiet confessions. To the historian, These were the hieroglyphs of the administrative unconscious, patterns of repetition, of control, of unseen care. To read them was to glimpse a world in which duty had replaced faith, and documentation had become a form of devotion. And yet, even the most precise devotion bred unease. For in its perfection lay the question, who was being served, the individual, or the idea of the state itself? The civil service regulations were meticulous in defining benefit and obligation, but they also defined silence. The applicant was not encouraged to question, only to comply. There were spaces for signatures, but none for doubt. To read the manual closely was to feel the air thicken around its phrasing, subject to discretion, at the pleasure of the Crown, as may be determined by the Treasury. These phrases were like distant echoes of power, soft and polite, yet absolute. Late at night, one might imagine the clerks who had drafted those very lines. Their offices lit by gaslight, their cuffs faintly ink-stained, their minds weary but steady. They might have felt themselves custodians of order, guardians of procedural purity. The pensions they codified were meant to sustain widows, retired servants, and loyal officers. And yet, perhaps, they also sensed the strangeness of what they were building, a self-perpetuating architecture of paper and principle that could endure longer than any government. In one forgotten ledger, bound in cracked maroon leather, there exists a passage written in elegant cursive: all claims to pension shall be subject to verification by the departmental head and the audit office, who shall ensure the integrity of each return. Below it, in faded pencil, someone, perhaps a junior clerk, had written a tiny note, and who verifies the verifier? It was swiftly erased, but the indentation remained, a ghostly question beneath the rule. There were always ghosts in paperwork, not of the supernatural kind, but of intention, hesitation, and omission. The archivists who later catalogued the pension regulations noticed peculiar consistencies in certain decades, years when applications seemed to pause, when approvals declined without cause. Some attributed it to administrative backlog, others to unseen wartime austerity. Yet, reading through those forms, one could feel a faint chill of absence, as though some unseen hand had brushed against the edges of the record and taken a few names away. The pension process itself was a rite of passage, though none would name it so. From the first submission to the final disbursement, it moved through corridors of calculation, the actuarial office, the signature chamber, the Treasury Committee. The claimant became a case number, the case number became an entry in a ledger, the ledger became a report, the report became an archive. At the end, what remained was an acknowledgement, an assurance that service had been noted, tabulated, rewarded, and filed. But the reward was not always what it seemed. Some applicants found their sums adjusted for administrative accuracy. Others were informed that the records of early service cannot be confirmed. The language was courteous, impersonal, final. The pensioner accepted it as one might accept the weather. There was a strange dignity in that acceptance, a quiet surrender to the larger rhythm of things. The regulations allowed for appeal, but few appealed. To appeal was to acknowledge dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction was unseemly in the presence of the state. And so, the machinery turned. It was fueled not by rebellion, but by submission. In every form filled, in every approval stamped, there was a trace of faith, faith in procedure, in formality, in the slow, impartial justice of the administrative mind. To question it would have been to dismantle the illusion that made it humane. By the mid-20th century, the pension regulations had become a symbol of continuity. Successive governments amended them, clarified them, printed them anew, yet their essence remained untouched. Each edition carried the same cadence, slow, balanced, judicial. It was a music of governance, composed in the key of restraint. Even the typography reinforced it, the clean serif type, the generous spacing, the austere margins. To read them was to feel the pulse of empire, long after its heart had quieted. The reader might close the manual and notice that the air feels slightly different afterward, denser, as though filled with invisible dust motes of memory. The pension forms were, in truth, more than instruments of payment, they were repositories of moral order. They told a story of what Britain once believed, that service should be rewarded, but never without restraint, that fairness required formality, that every promise must be written down to exist. And in that writing, that endless writing, the civil service found its immortality. For ink, once dry, cannot doubt. It only endures. It was said that deep beneath Whitehall, far below the hum of traffic and the shifting light of the Thames, there existed a place few had ever entered, and fewer still had understood. It was called, without irony, the Archive of Deferred Claims. There were no signs, no grand doorways, only a narrow staircase leading down from an unmarked service corridor. At the base, an iron gate barred the way, its paint thick with age, its hinges cold as ordnance. Beyond it, the air changed. It became denser, drier, heavy with the faint tang of dust and iron gall ink, the scent of bureaucracy in its most elemental form. Those who worked there, the archivists of the pension office, rarely spoke of it. Their days began not with conversation but with the shuffling of paper, the methodical unlocking of cabinets, and the brushing away of dust from forgotten folders. Their fingers bore faint stains, their breaths came quiet and deliberate. They did not read the records as one reads a story, but as one listens to an echo, tracing patterns of repetition and omission. To them, each form was a pulse, each regulation a heartbeat. The archive, in its vastness, was strangely beautiful. Its corridors stretched endlessly, lit by lamps that buzzed with the same quiet persistence as the clerks above. Pigeonholes of oak and brass extended floor to ceiling, numbered in meticulous sequence. In some rooms, the paper had yellowed to the color of candlelight, in others, it remained pale and crisp, as though defying time itself. It was a museum of obedience, and every document was a relic of devotion. There were whispers that the oldest pension forms, the ones dating back to the mid-19th century, still carried the faintest warmth of the original signatures, as though the ink had never fully dried. In the margins, the handwriting wavered, neat copperplate dissolving into tremor. These were the men and women who had served before the language of service became standardized. They wrote not yet as bureaucrats, but as believers, in the promise that loyalty, rendered faithfully, would one day return in the shape of a pensionable sum. And yet, in those early records, there were oddities. A misaligned date here, a missing name there. Sometimes the occupation column would be filled with curious entries: temporary examiner, sub-inspector without post, or assistant to the assistant registrar. Roles that appeared nowhere else, existing only in the form's imagination. The archivists called them the phantom positions. When questioned, their superiors shrugged and said such inconsistencies were the residue of administrative transition. But some among the younger clerks wondered whether they were not the residue of something else, an attempt to document a service that had never quite existed, or to remember a person who had already been forgotten. It was difficult to tell. For the pension regulations required that every claim be verified, but they did not specify how to treat those whose verification had been lost. The rule was simple: no record, no entitlement. And so, the archive absorbed them, the unconfirmed, the misplaced, the delayed, until they became indistinguishable from the dust that coated their folders. In time, the shelves filled not only with the approved and the rejected, but with a third category, the unresolved. These were the files that had slipped between definitions, existing in perpetual administrative suspension. A clerk once described them as the waiting souls of the bureaucracy. It was a poetic exaggeration, but not entirely untrue. For to handle those files was to sense something uneasy, the faint vibration of intent without conclusion. The papers were real, the names legible, the signatures present, yet the process that would have granted them finality had never been completed. They were forms in search of closure, drifting indefinitely within the system that had birthed them. To wander the archive at night, and some did, when sleep eluded them, was to hear the whisper of paper expanding and contracting with the shifts in air. The sound resembled breathing, though faint, rhythmic, and dry. One archivist swore that on certain nights, when the fog from the river crept through the ventilation shafts, she could hear a soft rustling, as if hundreds of pages were turning themselves in unison. Another, less prone to imagination, admitted that he had once found a folder left open that he did not recall opening. Inside was a pension form dated 1902, written in ink that had not faded. The applicant's name was Mr. D. F. Holloway, but no such record appeared in any index. The pension number was marked pending. The space for the approving officer's signature was blank. He placed it back carefully and locked the cabinet, but afterward he began to dream, of rooms filled with forms, of pens that wrote without hands, of regulations whispered in a voice that belonged to no one. When he resigned the following spring, he left no explanation, only a note that read, "Everything here is still waiting." The archivists who remained learned to ignore the strangeness. They worked steadily, methodically, performing their duties with quiet reverence. Each file they opened was treated as sacred, for it represented the weight of a life measured in clauses and columns. There was comfort in the structure, the clear categories, the uniformity of the process. And yet, beneath that comfort, there lingered a subtle melancholy, the awareness that the rules preserved more than they revealed. One of the most curious volumes stored in the archive was the Consolidated Civil Service Pension Regulations, 1887. Bound in dark calfskin, it bore the insignia of the treasury embossed in gold. The pages were thin but resilient, and the ink remained sharp after more than a century. Inside, the regulations unfolded with a calm authority, paragraphs upon paragraphs of balanced phrasing, every sentence concluding with grace. But near the back, there was a section that few had noticed until a scholar stumbled upon it decades later. It was titled Supplementary Provision for Officers Unclassified under the Existing System. The section was brief, no more than 2 pages, and oddly phrased. It stated that in cases where the identity of a civil servant could not be confirmed, but where the pattern of service may be reasonably inferred, a pension might still be granted, provided the record bore the requisite marks of official formatting. In other words, if the form looked correct, it could be treated as genuine. The idea was pragmatic, perhaps even humane, but its implications were enormous. It meant that the form itself could authenticate existence, even in the absence of evidence. The archivists called it the clause of apparent service. And though it was quietly removed from later editions, its spirit persisted, whispered about, occasionally invoked when dealing with an incomplete record or a missing certificate. Over time, it became a legend among the clerical staff, the notion that one might live forever within the archives, so long as one's form was never disproved. It was this clause, they said, that explained why some pension files could not be closed, why some claims lingered indefinitely in provisional status. To close them would be to erase an existence that had once been validated by the form itself. And so the unclosed files multiplied, neat, labeled, patient. They were not forgotten, precisely. They were preserved, waiting for a decision that could never arrive. The archive came to feel less like a repository and more like a mechanism, a slow, pulsing organism of administration, feeding on the persistence of incompletion. Its walls absorbed the rhythm of classification, its floors recorded the soft echo of footsteps that had long ceased to belong to anyone living. It was said that to read too long within its chambers was to feel oneself flatten, to become part of the system's own syntax, a sentence awaiting closure, a form in need of a signature. And yet, there was serenity there, too. In the stillness between the shelves, one could sense a strange peace, the quiet satisfaction of order sustained. The pension forms, arranged by decade and division, reflected an almost monastic devotion to preservation. The rules, though exacting, offered comfort. The state, in its peculiar omnipresence, whispered reassurance, that nothing, once written, would ever truly vanish. Perhaps that was why the archivists continued, generation after generation, with unwavering calm. They were caretakers not only of records, but of continuity itself. In a world that changed beyond their walls, they guarded the still point, the place where service became memory, and memory became record. And in that stillness, the air carried an odd refrain, one that no one ever admitted to hearing aloud. The form endures. The form remembers. The form is the proof of life. There were rumors, unspoken but understood, that beneath the lowest level of the pension office archive lay one more chamber, one not listed on any architectural plan, nor noted in the Treasury's ledgers. It was sometimes called the sub-basement of forms awaiting verification, though no one could say for certain whether such a name appeared officially anywhere. Some said it had been sealed since the 1930s, when floodwater from the Thames had seeped into the foundations and destroyed several decades of records. Others whispered that it had never been sealed at all, only forgotten by design. The archivists who stayed late would occasionally feel a faint current of air rising through the cracks in the flagstones, dry and cool, smelling faintly of parchment and ink. No one was assigned to maintain that level, yet its presence was undeniable. The older clerks, when pressed, would only smile faintly and say, "It's best to work with the documents that are confirmed." But confirmation was, as ever, a fragile thing. Some pension forms bore all the Hollingsworth hesitated. He had heard the stories, of course, but he was not a man inclined to superstition. The archive was, after all, a rational institution, built upon logic, precision, verification. The thought that a lower level might exist, hidden yet operational, intrigued him more than it frightened him. That evening, after the others had left, he took the key and descended the staircase. The first door led to the official basement, where the temperature dropped noticeably and the air smelled of dust and iron. The second staircase, narrower, winding, unlit, was hidden behind a cabinet marked obsolete forms. It descended farther than expected, and the sound of his footsteps was swallowed by the weight of the stone around him. When at last he reached the bottom, he found a door of reinforced oak, its surface scratched by time, the paint darkened by moisture. He turned the key. The lock clicked softly, and the door opened into a corridor lined with shelves. It was colder here, much colder, and the silence was absolute. The shelves were arranged not in rows but in circles, spiraling inward toward a central space. Each file was wrapped in linen and labeled in handwriting far older than his own lifetime. The air smelled faintly of wax and something else, something faintly metallic, like the residue of ink left too long upon a nib. He took one file down at random. The paper was crisp, the writing neat. Application for civil pension under Regulation 112B. The name was unreadable, the ink having faded into a faint bruise of blue. But the rest of the form was intact, each column filled in precisely, the boxes ticked in an even, practiced hand. At the bottom, in place of the usual approving signature, there was a phrase written in small italic script, pending until further verification by the Department of Record. He replaced the file carefully, then opened another. It was the same, different name, different year, same phrasing. Pending until further verification. The form stretched endlessly, each identical in its incompletion. And then he noticed something peculiar. Every so often, one of the forms would include a faint watermark, a circular emblem, almost invisible, depicting a crown seal encircled by words too faint to read. He held one up to the lamp. The text, though difficult to make out, appeared to read, "The Department of Perpetual Service." He frowned. There was no such department. Or perhaps there had been, once. The pension regulations were known for their endurance. Clauses and departments often outlived their purpose. Some were quietly absorbed, others renamed, others left to fade from correspondence altogether. Yet there was something about the phrasing, perpetual service, that unsettled him. It sounded less administrative and more devotional. As he continued through the shelves, he began to feel the weight of the forms pressing inward. Each file was a name suspended in time, each document a promise without fulfillment. Together, they formed a kind of choir of waiting. It was not sound, not quite, but a pressure in the air, the collective stillness of things unfinished. Hollingsworth stopped at the center of the chamber. There, upon a single plinth, lay a massive ledger bound in black leather. Its clasp was open. The first page bore no title, only a number, 0, beneath it, in faint script, a sentence had been written. All claims unresolved shall be recorded here, until such time as verification is achieved. The following pages were filled with names, thousands, tens of thousands, arranged in precise columns. But where one might expect salaries, service years, or departmental codes, there were only dates, dates of submission, dates of revision, dates of transfer. The final column, headed Date of Closure, remained empty throughout. Hollingsworth turned the pages slowly, feeling the dryness of the parchment beneath his fingertips. Every page ended with the same faint mark, a single loop of ink, almost like a signature, but not quite. It was the same mark that appeared in the margins of older pension books, a looping flourish known among the archivists as the completion stroke. No one knew its origin. Some said it was the mark of a long-forgotten chief examiner, others claimed it appeared spontaneously, a sign that the document had settled fully into the archive's order. He closed the ledger gently and exhaled. The air was still. Then, from somewhere within the spiraling shelves, came a faint sound, not loud, but distinct, the soft drag of paper sliding against paper. It might have been the settling of air. It might have been nothing at all. But Hollingsworth found himself whispering aloud, though he did not know why, "Who verifies the verifier?" The echo of his voice lingered too long. He turned toward the staircase. The door stood open, its frame trembling faintly as though in a draught. When he reached it, he noticed something he hadn't before, a brass plate fixed to the wall beside it, half buried under paint and dust. He wiped it clean with his sleeve. The inscription read, "Sub-basement registry, pension forms, awaiting response." He locked the door behind him and returned to the upper floors, but the thought of that room, the spiral of shelves, the endless repetition of pending, would not leave him. The next morning, he checked the index for any record of Section 19. There was none. Nor was there mention of any Department of Perpetual Service. The key, which he had left on his desk, was gone. In the weeks that followed, Hollingsworth grew quieter. He performed his duties without error, but he no longer spoke much during the tea breaks. Once, an older archivist asked him whether he had ever found the missing file he'd been looking for. He hesitated, then said softly, "I think it found me." No one pressed him after that. The archive had its own ways of settling curiosity. Years later, when the building was refurbished, the lower levels were cleared and sealed. The renovation plans made no mention of any sub-basement, nor of any files that could not be accounted for. But in the pension index, a peculiar entry appeared without explanation: Form number 0, record verified. No corresponding document existed, yet the notation was approved, signed, and dated. And so the system, in its infinite composure, absorbed the anomaly. The ledger of incomplete forms was never mentioned again, but among the archivists, a quiet saying persisted: "The archive keeps what the living cannot." It was not spoken with fear, but with a kind of reverence, an acknowledgement that every regulation, every form, every meticulous clause was part of something larger and older than the people who tended it. The pension system, they said, was not merely an instrument of government. It was a form of remembrance, an act of preservation so complete that it blurred the line between service and existence itself. For even as the world above changed, as offices became digital, as ink gave way to data, as ledgers dissolved into screens, the spirit of the archive remained. Somewhere, perhaps beneath layers of concrete and time, the sub-basement of forms awaiting verification still existed. The air down there would be still and dry, the shelves heavy with paper, the ledger open to a page without end. And if one were to walk those halls in silence, one might hear the faintest whisper of movement, the shuffling of documents continuing their patient procession through eternity. Not a haunting, exactly. More a continuity. A bureaucracy of the beyond. And if one listened long enough, in that soft, endless hum of unfinished sentences and unclaimed pensions, one might hear a voice, calm and measured, reciting a familiar phrase. All claims shall be verified. All records shall be preserved. No service shall be forgotten. In the dim hush of the record's wing, where the air carried the scent of starch and dust, the final ledger lay open, its spine cracked but proud, its vellum pages still clinging to the inked words that once made a world move. The official British Civil Service regulations for pension applications had endured centuries of revisions, signatures, and minor reforms, and yet it persisted in spirit, not merely as a manual of procedures, but as a monument to the peculiar faith of empire, the belief that structure itself could defy mortality. It had outlasted ministers, monarchs, clerks, and typists alike. It outlasted even the forms it governed. And though paper yellowed, though pens ran dry, the regulations' language, that measured, meditative prose of administrative certainty, retained its peculiar rhythm, whispering through the corridors like a lullaby of empire. By the mid-20th century, few had reason to open the old ledgers. The world had turned to forms punched into machines, to carbon paper and digital keys. Yet in a locked room beneath Whitehall, beneath the official history, there remained a chamber known only to a few archivists. Its walls were lined with grey binders stamped with the insignia of bygone offices, His Majesty's Treasury, Civil List and Pensions Division, Colonial Service Records. Each bore its date and its clerk's initials, and each was weighted with the quiet burden of precision. Visitors entered rarely, and when they did, it was said that time behaved differently. The electric light seemed to dim as one walked between the cabinets, as though the very notion of modernity thinned. Here, paper still breathed. Here, the pension regulations still murmured their ancient formulae, as though the empire itself had never quite conceded its passing. At the heart of the chamber stood a desk of polished oak. Upon it rested the master copy, the regulation in its purest form, annotated by hand, every amendment cross-referenced, every line bearing witness to a vanished chain of thought. The handwriting of clerks long dead still shimmered faintly, as if resisting erasure. Each entry began with a phrase both familiar and ritualistic, in accordance with the instructions laid down by His Majesty's Civil Service Commission. The phrase was no longer law, and yet it retained something sacred. To read it aloud, archivists said, was to awaken the pattern that governed all forms, the rhythm of receipt and validation, acknowledgement and delay. Some whispered that the regulation was less a document and more a spell, a charm of bureaucracy that bound empire to eternity. The last known custodian of the regulation was an elderly archivist named Meredith Rowe. She had joined the civil service in 1958, trained under clerks who still used blotting paper and sealing wax, and had remained through every reform since. When the pension scheme was computerized in the 1980s, Rowe alone insisted on preserving the physical archives, arguing that the language of the original documents contained meanings not yet translatable to code. Syntax carries spirit, she once said softly to a visitor, her eyes reflecting the dull gleam of cabinet handles. Every form has a soul, if you know how to read it. Each morning, she descended into the underground archives with a thermos of tea and a small cloth to dust the ledgers. She spoke rarely but moved with reverence. There were stories among younger clerks that she sometimes heard voices whispering behind the shelves, faint dictations, the scratch of unseen pens. Others dismissed it as the hum of the ventilation. But those who worked beside her described a peculiar stillness in her presence, as if the old regulation itself respected her. On the day she retired, she signed her final pension application with a fountain pen whose nib had belonged to her predecessor, the Inca precise blue prescribed by the 1902 Stationery Directive. She folded the form carefully, placed it in the required envelope, and affixed a stamp, a real one, with the monarch's face, not a printed franking mark. Before sealing it, she whispered the closing clause of Section 12, all entitlements shall be duly considered under the proper attestation of service. It was a small, private benediction, the kind that had once been spoken by clerks in candlelight, when the pension roll was a scroll and the ink was still wet with ceremony. The form never returned. Months later, when a new clerk sought to locate her file, the record system produced an anomaly. Her entry existed, but the archive field was blank. No receipt number, no filing date, no closure mark. It was as though her application had vanished into the very bureaucracy it invoked. And yet, when the clerk went to the underground archive to search the paper records, the room was found perfectly ordered, the ledgers dusted, and on the oak desk lay a single page of fresh stationery, embossed with the civil service crest. Upon it was written, in Meredith Rowe's familiar hand, "Service acknowledged. Record complete." After her departure, the department underwent another reform. The archive was sealed, its contents digitized, and the physical volumes relocated to an off-site repository in Kew. The lights in the old chamber were switched off for the last time, and for several months no one entered. But when contractors arrived to remove the furniture, they found the faint smell of ink and oil still hanging in the air. And on the floor beneath the oak desk was a thin, folded slip of paper. It was a pension application form, blank, but for a date written neatly in pencil, January 1st, 1901. The day Queen Victoria died. Some dismissed the find as coincidence, a relic misplaced during cataloging. Others noted that the handwriting, fine, deliberate, unmistakably Edwardian, did not match any sample in the known archives. A historian from the Cabinet Office was brought to inspect it, and after several days of examination, she concluded only that the ink used for the date did not correspond to any period pigment. It seemed newer than it should have been. When she held it to the light, faint watermark letters appeared, civil eternity form. The term existed nowhere in any government document. And yet, as she said later in an interview, it felt like something that should exist. Time went on. Governments changed. Offices closed, reopened, merged, and vanished again under new names. But now and then, an internal memo or committee briefing would refer obliquely to the foundational regulations, or to legacy entitlements under prior enactment. Those who searched for the source would eventually trace it back to the same root, the official British Civil Service regulations for pension application forms, the old master document, never formally repealed. Even as new frameworks replaced it, the regulations' clauses lingered, embedded like sediment in modern law. Every form, digital or otherwise, still bore its pattern, the triad of declaration, verification, and attestation. To sign was still, in some faint echo, to perform the ancient ritual of acknowledgement that once bound clerk to empire. Archivists began to describe this persistence as the ghost structure, a term that soon entered bureaucratic folklore. The phrase appeared in research papers, then in fiction, and finally in urban legend. There were tales of forms that completed themselves, of documents that reappeared after deletion, of pension claims processed for employees long deceased. All were dismissed as error, as database corruption, as myth. Yet among those who had read the original regulation, there remained a quiet understanding: the form had never been merely administrative. It was a mechanism of memory, a means by which the state remembered itself. And memory, once encoded, does not easily die. On certain nights in the National Archives, guards still reported a peculiar hum from the storage floors. The air conditioning systems, perhaps, or the low vibration of pipes. But when one leaned closer to the shelves, to the boxes marked Pension Regulations, 1894 to 1947, one might hear something more distinct: the rustle of paper turning itself, the creak of leather binding settling, the faint, rhythmic tap of a pen. As if somewhere deep within the archive, the last civil servant still sat at her desk, maintaining the balance of names and numbers, ensuring that every entry, every life, was properly accounted for. In that sound, quiet, repetitive, almost like breathing, one could hear the essence of bureaucracy made eternal. Not cold, but oddly comforting. For in those endless regulations, in those clauses of precision and patience, there was something profoundly human, the yearning to be seen, to be recorded, to be granted one's due after a lifetime of service. The pension was never merely money. It was remembrance. It was the promise that one's name, written once in careful ink, would not fade. And so, even now, as the world drifts further from paper and into light, the form abides. In the hum of databases, in the pulse of bureaucratic code, the old rhythms persist: declaration, verification, attestation. Somewhere in the unseen circuits of the civil machine, the ghost of the regulation continues to approve applications, to stamp the eternal seal of acknowledgement upon the names of the forgotten. Should one ever find oneself walking the empty corridors of Whitehall late at night, past the portraits of ministers and the closed mahogany doors, and should one hear the faint rustle of paper though no wind is moving, one might imagine that the pension clerks are still at work. That they have never stopped. That they are still there, balancing ledgers in the dark, ensuring that no service goes unrewarded. And if one listens closely enough, one might even hear the final whisper of the regulation itself, its tone patient and solemn, reciting the clause that closes all others. All accounts shall be settled in the fullness of time. And in that moment, one might understand, as the midnight historian always does, that history, like bureaucracy, never truly ends. It simply waits, in perfect order, for its next signature.